Alright, so hello. So today's blog is going to concern two different things. The first of them is going to be, I'll talk about feminism and I'll talk about Richard Dawkins, but I feel more like talking about Richard Dawkins. So I just watched a video on the fallacy of coincidences, basically, by Richard Dawkins. And it's funny because the first time that I encountered his work, and uh, it happened to be a coincidence. It just so happened that the I noticed it was published on the 22nd of 2010. So those digits, no, 22nd of November 2010. So those digits are 22 and 2 and 1. So, and it just happened that it had 2,221 comments. And my comment was the 2,222nd. So that in itself is kind of a coincidence, um, because whatever the logical explanations that he brings up in the video about coincidences, it doesn't explain why he happened to post on the 22nd of 2010, why this or why this video happened to have been posted on the 22nd of 2010, whereby the commenter who would have made the 2,222nd comment would have noticed, or would have had the chance to notice, that there were 2,221 comments hitherto. But this is getting into detail. However, I don't think that that's an argument to discredit me by, because, as I'll point out, Dawkins' argument's rather weak. Now, I usually avoid Dawkins. I'd heard a lot about him and read a lot about him, but I don't think that I'd ever actually heard the man speak. If I did, I'm forgetting. But it's interesting to note that this is basically the first time that I'm encountering his work. And it happens to be uh, on coincidences. And in the process, I have a coincidence. Now, one might say, well, obviously, Dimitri, you've always shown an interest in coincidences and synchronicities. And and so it's no surprise that you would have noticed such a coincidence. But I would like to argue that that in turn, actually, if you look at the logic from a different perspective, from a different angle, that in turn increases the whole uncanniness of the coincidence. Because, for one thing, my noticing the coincidence does not necessarily predispose that I will value it. You know, Dawkins seems like the kind of person who would notice a coincidence and not value it. But also, my valuing coincidences does not necessarily predispose me to noticing them. So you might say that in order to really have a synchronicity, one has to meet two criteria. And there are the people like Dawkins who might meet only one criteria, and there are other people who might meet none of them. So Dawkins' whole argument is that basically within a controlled system, a controlled experiment, um, which is basically a very reductionistic thing on his part that he did with a number of young children and flipping coins. Uh, Basically, inevitably you'll have a coincidence. But at the very beginning of the video, he basically says that the scientific method depends upon peer review and things of this nature, what Søren Kierkegaard, the philosopher, referred to as the mass, and neglects individual, what we would call anecdotal evidence. But in a very interesting way, Dawkins is prejudicing the inquiry from the very beginning, in order to advance a logical agenda, which is biased. Because although, yes, in a controlled experiment of that particular kind, which he more or less arbitrarily relates to coincidences as such, and here one might make a very distinct uh, distinction between coincidences and synchronicities. The synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence, But a number of people who believe in synchronicities don't necessarily say that all coincidences qualify as synchronicities. So you might say, if you're interested in synchronicities, you might already disregard Dawkins' argument as qualifying for a coincidence but not a synchronicity. Secondly, obviously, what's manipulative about Dawkins' tactics is that, or his tic-tac, no, his tactic, is that he sets up an experiment which is completely under his control, completely the product of the directed conscious process, wherein there will inevitably be a coincidence. Of course, he's teaching this to kids who don't know better. I mean, kids thankfully have open minds, but he's conditioning them in a somewhat religious fashion, um, somewhat the way of a priest. And this I find to be a bit disparaging because in a group of adults, someone might say, but what about this? And, what about this philosophical argument? Wait, isn't this contrary to science? No, he's teaching this to kids. He's using a very childlike example. Fair enough if you want to convince kids of your point of view, but he's also being a bit condescending. This has been noticed about him by his colleagues. Well, let's look at this exercise in reductionism, basically. He set up the condition, given an audience, where a coincidence will be inevitable. But if you look at synchronicities, these crazy coincidences, they're oftentimes not inevitable. Now, let's look at some of the things that I've learned about synchronicities from other people who've had these experiences, and what the science, or what people like Dawkins would like to call pseudoscience, although there's no real reason to call it pseudoscience, and I'll get into that in a moment. Let's look at what they're saying, and the coincidence that this happens to line up with my experience. I'm going through a transitional period right now in my life, which I'm not going to go into, it's very personal. But suffice to say, I just finished filling up a journal of mine. And you might say, well, my unconscious mind just so happened to plan it out so that I'd finish this journal, um, just much like a novel, just as I'm reaching a climactic point in my life, a transitional period, where I'm undergoing things which I won't specify, but conscious and unconscious transformations which are creating a great deal of emotional upheaval. Wittgenstein's argument, you have to treat an emotion as a fact. Now you might say, well, that's just your unconscious mind planning it out that way or noticing that, and that may be true. But the question is, where does the unconscious mind end and the universe begin? That's actually a serious, sensible question, because in a manner of speaking, everything that we're aware of occurs within our minds. This is a solipsistic argument, so you might say it's metaphysically arbitrary. These aren't just big words, these are very specific words. Just like scientific language. It's metaphysically arbitrary to say that the unconscious mind isn't somehow related to the rest of the universe, that we're separate from it. In fact, if you really go deeply into any kind of philosophy, you see the arbitrariness of this way of thinking things. Like if you start deconstructing things and look into postmodern thought, or even pre-postmodern thought, and even classical thought, if you really study the history of it. So Dawkins' materialistic view seems very arbitrary. Now, let me give you an example of something. In the midst of all these upheavals, I've been having a lot of stress recently. And you might say, well, obviously, you're just, always in your life you're going through a transitional period, and that's true, we're always growing. But there's something that Jung describes as the transcendent function. There's a particular feeling that we get of losing control of our lives, of being taken over by a lot of new emotions at once. And you can notice a change in one's dreaming life and one's dreaming patterns, and the very feeling present of being anxious and being in a transitional period is immediate evidence of this. Like Wittgenstein said, emotions are facts, and what does the emotion reveal? I know that Dawkins is a thinking type, but for me as an emotional person, one who tends to give his emotions a lot of credit, what we would call feeling type, which isn't an illogical person, it just means that feeling tends to have a kind of dominant function in one's psyche, and this is all well and good. It's really a matter of just temperament, you might say. A feeling person will note that the sort of anxiety that one feels is indicative of a change. You see, a logical person will note probably individual moments. A feeling person will notice the transition from between those moments. Now, it's said that synchronicities tend to occur for people who have a lot of spiritual experiences, either serendipitously or of their own accord. And they also tend to really happen at a transitional period in one's life. The thing is that they tend to be meaningful. That's the thing. They're not merely numerical, like in Dawkins' example. They tend to have a personal significance, suggesting perhaps what Dawkins most loathes, the notion of a personal quality in one's relationship to the universe. Now, it may be true that, well, anyone, inevitably, in a video about coincidences, you might say someone will have been the 2,222nd commenter. Okay, first of all, that's not inevitable, because you might have not become that popular. That's always a possibility. Secondly, it's something to be said that this is my first encounter with Dawkins, and I'm going to relate this to a specific instance, which I happened to recount yesterday, and which I didn't blog about, so I don't have that on record as evidence. And since it's personal to me, I don't want to reveal it right now, but the first thing in my new journal is actually a reflection upon this, and I could produce it if asked to. It just so happens that Dawkins, this is my first formal encounter with Dawkins, my first intentional encounter with his works. I'd heard about him before. I thought I should give him a fair shot. It happens that he's talking about coincidence, and I encounter this kind of coincidence. Now, the religious function, the religious instinct tells me, this is an irony. God is telling me to restore my faith in God by showing me this person who professes a disbelief in God and a disbelief in coincidence in the form of an uncanny coincidence. And I say, well, this is superstitious thinking. Remember what Wittgenstein said, feelings are facts, not just logic. And even Bertrand Russell had a room for his in his life philosophy for mysticism. But of course it's met with a good deal of scorn. So when it has trepidation, given our education in acknowledging this. But okay, so it just happens though that I come on the scene and I've never encountered his work before. I'm not a rabid fan, and I'm not yet a rabid skeptic. And my comment is 2,222. And this is my first comment, and my only comment, if you don't count all of my replies as comments. Well, you can imagine this. Now, what was this experience that I was recounting yesterday, which I wrote a poem about? It was a very similar experience. I was at a speech and debate tournament. And this was itself part of a sequence of coincidences, because I happened to be coming home. Oh, hold on, I have to check something. Okay. So I happened to be coming home from something or another. And I got a call, or I got a message on my Facebook from a friend of mine named Arthur, who's a Christian, and I think that he asked me for advice with dream journaling. So I got on the phone with him, and I opened up the dream journal that I'd been keeping randomly, and picked out more or less what I thought would be, what felt like good dream journals. And I had been keeping a dream journal for a long time. See here where the reductionist fallacy is starting to fall apart. It just so happened that the dream that I read to this fellow involved my revisiting a campus which I'd visited in a speech and debate tournament years ago. I did not know, consciously at least, that my friend was head of the speech and debate team at the same high school now. And for a moment, I almost thought I should not tell him this, because it seemed unimportant. But I told him, and because of that, as a result of that, there was a very important transitional period in my life, which I don't regret for one moment, which was when I became a volunteer for speech and debate. And it just so happened that that same weekend, there was a tournament at the same high school, the annual tournament which I had remembered in my dream. And I went to volunteer there. Now, in order to prepare, I began to read up on philosophy. And when I went there, that was my first formal encounter with the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, a brilliant philosopher who was also an atheist. And I encountered a tome there, which was written towards the end of his life. Nietzsche happened to have written a lot of books. Now it's possible that the story I'm recounting, which involves a girl, may not be too coincidental, because perhaps the girl who used the resource that I am describing had in fact used the same exact tome. The thing is, I was reading The Will to Power. And this was my first real encounter with Nietzsche's work. Notice, first real encounter, just like with Dawkins, first real encounter. And I noticed his style was very peculiar. I really loved the way that he wrote. It was ingenious. And then I went to judge this round, and she began to, and this was my first time judging this particular kind of event. It was the first time. And she began to talk about, she began to run an argument which seemed vaguely familiar to me in style, although not in words. I asked at the end, while I was giving my critique, "Is that by any chance Nietzsche?" She said, "Yes." Well, I'd known about Nietzsche marginally, like I'd known about Dawkins marginally, but I'd never actually encountered his work. So I went back and opened up the tome, and the page that I cracked open to, reading the text, and it was exactly, verbatim, exactly the argument that she'd used. And I felt like God was looking me straight in the face. Notice I recalled this yesterday for the first time in a very long time, and I wrote about it, reflecting upon that weekend in general. Usually I don't make this my main focus, although I do a lot of dream journaling. But that particular instant was just one of a number of things. It was a particular irony which I encountered again today. Today. And notice that Dawkins' experiment does not apply in this situation, because there is no inevitability that that book would be open, that exact volume would be opened again, that exact page would be opened to, at that exact location within minutes of this person using this resource. There's no guarantee, as in his experiment, that someone at another speech and debate tournament would have had such a coincidence. There is no guarantee that such a thing would have happened. And so, one must not ignore this. Because, here's the thing, Dawkins really aggrandizes public opinion. And yet, he does not recognize the relativism of that. You could just as easily marginalize public opinion and say, I'm just going to focus on my individual life. And what you notice is that when coincidences do happen, they are at once incredibly improbable, that is, not inevitable, They are incredibly meaningful. And they comprise a series, usually, which is incredible. My final argument is that Dawkins really loves Darwin. He loves the facts that Darwin produced, therefore we choose to qualify scientific facts as facts. It's epistemologically arguable. But I'm not going to argue it right now. The thing about it is that Darwin's findings were based upon observing coincidences. This over here looks like that over there. He didn't have a plan. It was a discovery. And he chose to lend it meaning. Now, why in the world would we not apply the same kind of inspired rigor to the realm of coincidence, the possibility that in fact the universe is a mind? Rupert Sheldrake points out with incredible academic precision why we're biased in favor of this arbitrary materialistic worldview and how this is contrary to the spirit of science. Dawkins cuts into things with this kind of precision, thinks for you. He doesn't seem to have the brilliance of a good scientist, like a Jung, like a Sheldrake, like an Einstein. All that he really seems to do is provide a religious comfort for people who feel that they understand the world through the scientific method without having to question the basis of that scientific method as philosophy would do, and who feel that they don't ever have to worry about anything but their own intellect. It's very comforting to rule out the God hypothesis, but it's reductionistic, it's hypocritical, and it's silly. I thought I was going to talk about feminism, but yeah, I think this is it.